so much for checking us out here at Harvest Online. We're so glad you decided to make us a part of your day, wherever you're watching from and whenever you're watching. If you would do us a favor, click that subscribe button right there. And we would also love you to follow and like our other social media pages on Instagram and Facebook as well, and follow along here. Harvest, we are cruising through the summer and also the Psalms of Ascent, which are 14 Psalms from Psalm 120 to 134 that the nation of Israel would sing, they would recite, they would remember as they would take their journey up to the holy city that was built in the mountains or in the hills in Israel, as they would go and observe the feast. And so these are things that would help spur us on to love God, to teach us attributes about God, to recite things about Him, to have joy, like we talked about last week, and all various types of things. And so when you think about Psalms and you think about these types of things, one of the things is like it matters who wrote them. And so Psalm 127 is actually written by David's son Solomon. And Solomon was the wisest person that ever lived. He prayed and asked God to give him wisdom. He wanted to be the wisest person. And therefore, reading of this psalm is a little bit different. We read this psalm not only as a song, but also as practical wisdom. The same way that we might read a proverb, right? When we think about it, and Solomon wrote the book of Proverbs, we read this psalm and say, hey, there's some practical wisdom in it that we can take out and glean from. Solomon is creating a commentary about life, things that he sees, things that he's experienced, and he's making a commentary about it. And in this case, specifically about the idea of work. So we read it from the practical standpoint, which is different because the Psalms are songs. For the most part, they're songs that people would recite and read. And so there's a poetic nature, which makes them difficult sometimes to bring a practical application, because you're trying to marry two things like oil and water, right? Or a square peg and a round hole or something like that. And so this psalm though is more practical. So we read it from a practical standpoint, not necessarily from a literary standpoint. And it is not necessarily descriptive, but prescriptive of our life. So this one is not necessarily descriptive, but it is prescriptive. And so when we read it, it's practical and it's prescriptive. And so here's what Psalm 127 says. Solomon writes, "Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchmen stay awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go too late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for He gives to His beloved sleep." So this staying up late, getting up early with a bunch of anxiety, and I got to get this done, and now I'm worried about this and all this stuff. What Solomon is saying is, out of this place of wisdom, is that it's actually in vain that you do that. Like it doesn't really benefit you whatsoever. "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them." So having a bunch of kids, "he shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies at the gate." And so you see this psalm written by Solomon. It's filled with wisdom, and it's prescribing for us some things that we should take out of it and glean in our life. Now, we said this is a psalm about work. In fact, each section of Psalm 127 pertains to something we work for, work to build, or work against. And so here's what you got. You got verse 1, which is home and community. He talks about the house and the city being built. So we're talking about our home, right? Whether it be our practical home or like the home that we are cultivating with our wife and our kids and the values and all of those types of things. And our community, meaning our practical community, the community that we live in, and the community that we cultivate of our friends and our relatives and our acquaintances and our co-workers. So verse 1 talks about home and community, meaning house and city. Verse 2 talk about work and rest. Right? God set it up as rhythms, 6 and 1, 6 and 1, 6 and 1. You'll work 6 days, you'll rest 1. So there's a rhythm to it. So he talks about work and rest. Rising up early and going late to rest, meaning this anxious toil. We live in a society today that prides itself on getting up early, staying up late, achievement, accomplishment, pride, getting less sleep. But as long as we achieve something, so it's talking about and addressing work and rest. Verses 3 through 5 are talking about family. He's talking about children, especially children, about how they are quivers, right? Or arrows in the quiver, and that it's a blessing, right? And then verse 5, the enemies, adversaries, and adversity, which are enemies. So all of these things, right, they are going to be put to shame. All of these things are pertain to something that we work for, work to build, or work against. And each of these categories are things that are important to us and matter in our life. And so the premise of the psalm is work. We work, but more importantly, God works. So it's this idea of we work, right? We work for these things. We work to build these things. We work against these things. But more importantly than that, God works, because the entire Psalm of Solomon starts like this: unless the Lord builds and unless the Lord watches. So he's making this commentary on life and saying that we can work in vain. All of the work that we put forth, all the things that we strive for, all the anxious toil that we have are things that we work for in vain, because unless the Lord builds the house, unless the Lord watches over it, there actually isn't a lot of meaning and purpose behind it. So the psalmist presupposes that God does work. He guards, he builds, and he gives. It's like the psalm is similar to how the story of God began. He didn't sit among the cosmos. In the beginning, God created, God intervened, God had action, God worked. Work is creation, work is action, right? He created, it's an action, it's a verb, right? The universe did not just happen by chance, it was created. There was action that led to its existence. So God is a God that works. He makes things, he molds things, he shapes things. God is a God that is involved. He's not distant. He's not removed. He fashioned heaven and earth. God is a God that is intentional. He is a God that has purpose. He is a God that has direction. And so this psalm is a psalm about work and about, yes, it brings out things that we work for, work in, work against, and all those types of things. However, but it is mostly a psalm about how God works, right? Unless the Lord builds the house, unless the Lord watches. And it harkens us back to Genesis and how he worked then. And so here's kind of what the psalm, I think, is trying to tell us, that God worked and God is working. Or maybe you could say it like this: because God worked, because God has worked, God is currently now working, and God will futuristically work. Right? So he is a God of work. God worked back then and is working now because God is a working God. And if we are made in God's image, then we are people who work. Right? We are not people who are lazy. That's 2 Thessalonians 3, 11 through 13. However, we also don't work for our gain only, but work as a vehicle for doing God's work and what he's put the church here to do. And what separates a disciple of Jesus from another person in personal relationships that we create and develop in the places we work. God's work can be done within the structure of any job, of any calling, of any profession, at any education level, right? In fact, those jobs, we get the opportunity to practice what God is doing in our communities by loving, encouraging, and praying for others. So for the disciple of Jesus, what we understand is that our work is purposeful. It has a purpose. If we're working for God, if we're allowing God to build the house, if we're allowing him to watch over it, it has purpose. However, if we're just working for the sake of working for ourselves, we're doing it anxiously, and we're doing it selfishly, then we're doing it just in vain. So in the same way, each section of Psalm 127 pertains to something we work for, work to build, or work against. Each section also shows us what is most important in our work. Each category of Psalm 127 moves beyond the tasks of everyday life. It moves to relationships. And so what it does is it kind of talks about our work, but then it moves beyond. It talks about what's most important in our work. So what is most important in our work? Verse 1, home and community, meaning our household, the people in our house, and our neighbors. Is it important to cut our grass and to clean our house and to keep it up and to be good stewards? Yes. But what's most important is to work for the people in our house, to work for them, to bless them, to work with them, right? And our neighbors. Is it important to go about our daily activities? Yes. Is it important to keep our community safe? Yes. But why? For the sake of our neighbors. Verse 2, work and rest, meaning co-workers in our personal relationship with God. It moves beyond the anxious toil and says that when God puts us in a place to work, we're there for our co-workers, that our work moves beyond what we were hired to do and is there for the purposes of God, but also the personal relationship that we have with God, that we have to rest, that we can't get up and work because we need to have space, we need to have time, we need to have margin to develop and cultivate a relationship with God. Verses 3 through 5 talk about family, spouses, and children. We work, but we also do so for spouses and children. In verse 5, enemies, adversaries, and adversity, people that are hard to pray for, are also part of this work. So each verse details what it is like to see the world through the lens of a disciple of Christ. Our view is beyond the tasks and toward relationship. People become the center of the Christian work. Our work becomes on the edge. God's work becomes in the center. And God worked, and He's also working. And so He's working in and through us during this moment because His work has always been about people. So in this psalm, which is so rich and is more practical, Solomon is kind of using these categories to talk about these are the places that we're going to work in, but these also are the things that the people that we need to work for, right? And he talks about and moves beyond just the normal tasks that we do day in and day out and says, but God's work is actually geared toward people. It's geared toward the people that are in our homes, the people that are in our communities. It's geared toward the co-workers that are in our places of business. It's geared toward our family, our spouse, and our kids. It's geared toward praying for our enemies and adversaries and all of those types of things. That's God's work, right? Because God worked and God is working. And the way that God is working in today's time is through His church. And so Solomon gives us something very, very practical to kind of take back, that our work is on the edge, but God's work becomes in the center. That our work becomes on the edge of what our focus is, but the work of God, the purposes of why God has put us in a certain place, in a certain home, in a certain community, in a certain place of business, around a certain group of people, is really at the center of God's heart and why He's always worked, which is for people, right? So that is the purpose of the psalm. It's very, very practical in nature, less like song, literary, but very practical in nature. And it's trying to get us to understand that people are at the center of the Christian work and that we have to look through these kind of day in and day out tangible tasks and look beyond those things to see what is at the heart and at the center of God's work. And it's always people. And so our work becomes on the edge, right, of our life. But God's work, God working for people, becomes at the center of our purpose for our existence and why we're in our home and why we're in our community and why we have families and why God has called us for this such a time as now. So our work is on the edge. God's work is at the center because God worked and God is working and He will always work. God bless you.